Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and hosted by me, Israel Smith. In this episode, we're talking about the life of Private Carl Hacker.
Yeah.
So Matt, tell us a little bit about Carl Hacker, and the story that we're going to hear about is his service in the Civil War.
Sure, yeah.
And before we get into the story, what was the effect that the Civil War had on our village?
It was pretty profound. As I will mention in the story itself, there were a really high number of men from Mokena who volunteered for the Union Army during the Civil War. In fact, if you take all of Frankfort Township, which is Mokena and Frankfort, I have only been able to identify maybe 2 or 3 Civil War soldiers who were actually conscripted into the army or drafted, ordered to go, of the at least 100 men from Frankfort Township that fought. These were all volunteers.
Wow.
Who decided to put their lives on hold and take part in, from my perspective at least, the biggest event, most important event in the country's history. To be kind of grim, the casualties were high. In Mokena alone, let's see, just kind of counting through in my head right now, there must have been around 10 or so men who were either killed in battle or died of disease. I think the number may actually be a little higher. And many more than that who were wounded, came home missing arms, legs, stuff like that. Guys who were injured during the war made it through the war itself, but came home only to suffer literally for years from their injury, only to die decades later, basically casualties of the war. And this is just one man's story. We could do an entire podcast just on Mokenians of the Civil War, and what their experiences were, what they did. All of our cemeteries in town are loaded with old Union soldiers. It was really a pretty watershed moment in the history of our community, going on right at the very start, because the Civil War, as we know, started in 1861, and Mokena was only founded in 1852. So
How many people do you think were in town around that time?
Let's see. What did the 1860 census say? I would, without having, the documentation and stuff in front of me, I would say that Mokena, as the yet unincorporated village at that time, easily had a few hundred people maybe in town, in town proper, with more in the surrounding areas, the farms outside of town. We could actually, if we looked at the 1860 census or the 1859 Will County Directory, we could actually physically count everybody one by one. But it was pretty small. I mean, it was a very, very small community at the time. And even, as I was saying, a few hundred, even that would probably be pushing it.
Within the article that we're going to go through, I think it mentions that at least 45 men served in the Civil War from Mokena.
That's true.
So that's a significant burden on a village this small,
sure.
with a population that small.
Absolutely, it was. Yeah.
So what a sacrifice, not only for those men like Mr. Hacker that served, but for the families that were back in a time where you didn't hear anything. We didn't know anything but a couple news stories.
That's right. Yeah.
It was a sacrifice by everybody, by the community, and by the country as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this is, I think I say it every time, but this is another great story. You have a passion for the Civil War, so that comes out in this as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So let's get into it.
In the annals of our country's history, the most high-profile moments happened in locales far from Mokena. The watershed moment in America's story, the Civil War, is one of these events that most of us consign to distant places, be they Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Vicksburg, Mississippi, or even Chancellorsville, Virginia. While the front lines in the struggle would have been a hard, days-long trip from Will County, our community was just as affected by the conflict as all others were across the United States as they existed in those days, now a century and a half in the past. All one must do is visit Mokena's cemeteries to find the time-honored graves of dozens of Abraham Lincoln's soldiers. At least 45 Mokena men, some mere teenagers, took to the musket to preserve the Union. This is the story of Carl Hacker, a private soldier's life after the guns fell silent. To understand Hacker's life, we have to first examine its beginning. Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Hacker was born February 23, 1846, at a place called Rosenhagen, a postage stamp-sized windswept village on the Baltic Sea in what is today northern Germany. The son of Heinrich Hacker and Hannah Kitzerow, the boy's homeland would be torn asunder with tumult and revolution from the time he was an infant, and like so many of his countrymen in search of a better, more stable life, Karl Hacker left the German plain and made his way to America as an adolescent. Barely 17 years old, in October 1863, he and his brother Christian, who had a year on him, left the port of Hamburg aboard the John Bertram, a wooden ship guided by huge sails. After a rough, weeks-long trip over the choppy waves of the Atlantic, the Hacker brothers first touched American soil and promptly made their way to eastern Will County. Karl Hacker's new home was thickly populated with his Teutonic brethren, and years later, in the early 20th century, Will County historian W. W. Stevens would matter-of-factly write that our neighborhood is indebted to Germany for many of her best citizens. Through the thick fog of the ages, it appears that Karl Hacker's first station here was the New Lenox Township farm of his aunt and uncle, Maria and Heinrich Schmuel, who at this point were already well established at their property along today's Route 30. Originally a resident of the hamlet of Mokena, Heinrich Schmuel worked as a laborer on the new Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad as it was built through our neck of the woods 11 years earlier.
All right, so first, I think the important thing to point out is that Karl Hacker at this time was 17 years old.
Yeah, pretty young.
When he came with his brother Christian.
Oh, yeah.
Spent weeks on a boat to get to the United States.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
and then made his way to eastern Will County, which is just amazing. I mean,
it is, yeah.
I can't imagine a 17-year-old nowadays, doing that, moving his whole life.
Right. Me neither.
So he came to his aunt and uncle Schmuel's.
Mm-hmm. That is true.
And where that was on Route 30 in New Lenox. Well, where would that be in perspective?
So yeah, that was on Route 30. As far as we can tell, at this time when Karl Hacker first sort of showed up on the scene, the Schmuel farm was located, let's see, how would I describe this? On the corner of Route 30 and Schoolhouse Road, that being the northwest corner. There is a Walgreens there now. This is sort of diagonally across the road from Lincoln Way Central.
Did the old schoolhouse used to sit there?
That is correct. That was where the, as we call it around here, the Schmuel School always stood.
To interrupt you, seen that sign and I thought that was the funniest. Schmuel School is...
Yeah.
But I never understood the context of it. So I'm sure a lot of people now appreciate Schmuel School.
Absolutely.
Where it came from. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Yeah, no, that was what appears to have been the sort of proto-homestead of the Schmuel family on that corner. And of course, that schoolhouse that was later moved onto the south side of Route 30 only dates from the 1930s. None of the people in this story would have known it. There was, however, a much older schoolhouse that was there before that, but that's a whole different story. But then later, Heinrich and Maria Schmuel, seems like they moved their farm a touch further to the east. Had to think for a second. To the east down Route 30, and sort of resettled on the south side of the road, right about where Target is nowadays. And they sort of built that up, and then that farm was in the family for a very long time. So I may have given the wrong location, come to think of it, of the original farm. I'm envisioning a map of New Lenox in my head. Okay, yeah, so I think I was wrong. The Schmuel farm, as it existed at the time when Carl Hacker showed up, was on the southwest side of the intersection. So if you're familiar with the area, it's where that Walgreens is now.
At the end of this, you talked about the new Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. So we're just getting the railroad coming in.
That is correct, yeah. The Rock Island had been here for about 10 years already by the time the Hackers, Carl and Christian, showed up. And Heinrich Schmuel, their uncle, was one of the laborers who helped physically build the railroad when it came through back in the 1850s. He having arrived in the country a little earlier, about 11 years, a little earlier than the Hacker brothers did.
Sure. So just to have a perspective of what an important time in the village this was.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, let's get back into it.
At the time Carl Hacker first set foot in our environs, America was already 2 years deep into our nightmarish Civil War. At this late date, we can only imagine what his reaction was to landing in a new country deep in the mire of war, and what feelings it awoke in him. On October 4th, 1864, the fresh-faced 18-year-old joined Company F of the 64th Illinois Volunteer Infantry in Joliet. Upon mustering in, he was measured at 5 feet 6.5 inches tall, with brown hair, hazel eyes, and a light complexion. It should be noted that young Hacker volunteered to join the Union Army, which begs the question as to what inspired this newly arrived immigrant, who by his own later testimony did not yet speak a lick of English, to risk life and limb for his newly adopted country so soon after his arrival. The 64th Illinois had already been under President Lincoln's wing for almost 3 years before Private Hacker came onto the scene, having been raised at Springfield's Camp Butler at the end of 1861. Picking up the moniker Yates Sharpshooters along the way, after then-Governor Richard Yates, the regiment had already been bloodied at various engagements in the western theater of the war, such as the Battle of Atlanta in the summer of 1864. At some unknown date, while on duty at Newport, North Carolina, Private Hacker was temporarily transferred to the 15th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. As such, certain details of his time in the service of the Union are murky, as it is hard to pin down when he was with which regiment. Not too long after New Year 1865, something happened that would follow young Carl Hacker for the rest of his life. Memories as to exactly when this mishap occurred were greatly clouded in the years thereafter. Was it on January 20th, or around February 15th? Maybe as late as March 20th? No one privy to it could agree. In any case, it was in the lead-up to the war's end. While at camp in Louisville, Kentucky, Private Hacker was with his company on drill, and while passing through a ravine at the Double Quick, the young man tripped and fell upon a small stump, absorbing the hard blow in his left side. Using the terminology of the day, it was clear that the fall caused a rupture in his torso. Not too long afterward, the rupture was further aggravated while he was unloading barrels of sugar, and marching through the Carolinas only made it worse. And at one point, the German-born private could barely walk. Further compounding this was the fact that Carl Hacker was taken prisoner on March 8th, 1865, at the Battle of Wise Forks near Kingston, North Carolina, an oft-forgotten engagement in the annals of the Civil War. He was held for about 18 days in the Confederate capital of Richmond, then in a stroke of luck exchanged for rebel prisoners and released, thus miraculously avoiding the untold horrors of the infamous holding pen at Andersonville, Georgia. Upon his return to Union Arms, he completed a roundabout tour of Indianapolis and St. Louis before mustering out of the Army on July 13, 1865, at Springfield. Carl Hacker was ultimately in the service for less than a year, but in those 10 months, he saw and did his share and earned the laurels to rightly call himself a veteran of the Civil War.
Yeah, I think that last sentence there is definitely true.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, for him to serve 10 months and go through all of that is quite an ordeal.
It was. Absolutely, it was. Yeah,
to be a Civil War POW, 18 months in Richmond. Tell us, do you know anything about the Battle of Wise Forks?
You know, as being a Civil War buff since my childhood, basically, when I was researching Carl Hacker's life and came across this incident when he was a POW, I had never heard of this battle before. So I had to look it up. And there's a little bit of information you can find online about it. But from what I gather, it wasn't too terribly big of an engagement. Definitely has not gone down in history as a Gettysburg or a Shiloh or Bull Run or what have you. But nevertheless, and it came right at the end of the war, basically about a month or so away from the war ending.
Do you know how many other people were taken prisoner with him?
I do not, unfortunately. And I wish I knew more about what the exact circumstances were, what exactly led him to becoming a prisoner or how he was captured. But
do you know if in his later years he talked about his military service?
You know, I kind of get the impression that he must have, at least a little bit. In any case, it wasn't a secret when he passed away much later on, which we'll get to. His obituary hailed him as a Civil War veteran. And when a biography of one of his sons, who I touch upon here a little bit, was written in the 1920s, I'll just say his name. It was George Hacker, was Carl Hacker's son, who was a pretty prominent guy around town, a prominent businessman, and served as mayor for quite a long time. George Hacker got a write-up about him and what all he had done in town in the 1920s in one of the Will County histories that was written at the time. And prominent people would have their lives written up and things like that. But in any case, as it's talking about George Hacker's life, it mentioned he is the son of Carl Hacker, who was a Civil War veteran and was in the Carolinas and had been taken prisoner. So the fact that when when George Hacker was being interviewed about his life, the fact that he wanted to mention his dad and his dad's service shows that was something that he must have been proud of. At least his son George was proud of it. So I kind of get the impression that he must have at least talked about the basics of what he went through, like with his children, if his son was privy to it.
The fact that he joined the Army not knowing a lick of English.
Right, yeah.
Just, again, speaks to how great, of a guy this was.
Right. Very, very patriotic to have just barely been fresh off the boat, literally, as they say, and he volunteered.
Incredible.
To fight in this horrible war that had been going on. Just speaks to how much he wanted to be an American.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In the hot summer of 1865, he went back home to New Lenox Township to his aunt and uncle Maria and Heinrich Schmuel's farm, where upon his return, his aunt would later remember that he was filthy and infested with body lice. The Schmuels got rid of his dirty uniform, while Maria bathed him, in the presence of her husband, she wanted it known. and treated his still festering injury with home remedies. Years later, Maria Schmuel would matter-of-factly go on the record stating that she was doing her patriotic duty and deemed it her duty as an aunt towards her nephew to assist him in the manner she did. After the war, life went on for Karl Hacker, and he married Maria Mau in November 1867 at the German United Evangelical St. John's Church in Mokena. It was with this tight-knit congregation that the Hackers would be affiliated for the rest of their lives. Maria was also a new arrival to the United States, having arrived here not even 4 years previous. The pair came to have 5 children between 1868 and 1880, namely, in the order of their birth, Louisa, Charles, George, Minnie, and Philip. Blessings were abundant, as they all lived well into adulthood. All of the Hacker children were born in Mokena except Philip, the youngest, who made his appearance when the family lived for a 2-year spell at Gallatin in northern Missouri. Of all his siblings, George Hacker's name is writ largest upon our village's narrative, as he would not only become a successful lumber and real estate man in Mokena, but was also mayor from 1915 to 1929. In the autumn of 1878, Karl Hacker bought a house on today's McGovney Street from Joachim Müller, paying the handsome sum of $600 for the property. The old homestead would stay in the family for decades. As so many of our townfolk have, Karl Hacker put food on the table courtesy of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, the lifeblood of Mokena. However, the injury he suffered in the war, while not sustained on the battlefield, was coming back to haunt him. As a result of the 1865 rupture, he suffered no small amount of hardship in his day-to-day life. By the end of the 1870s, while working as a laborer on the railroad tracks, section foreman and Front Street resident Patrick Brennan noticed that Hacker would hold back from lifting, and when asked why, would blame his war injury. Eventually, Brennan got him work cutting grass and pitching hay, as in the foreman's words, he could not do more at best. In regards to the old trauma, Brennan had seen it, and would bluntly say that it is very bad. Karl Hacker also worked as a switchman, and later became foreman of the railroad section himself, courtesy of Patrick Brennan's help, who after some time thought it would be an easier job for the old soldier. All in all, Hacker put in 43 years for the Rock Island in Mokena. As the years marched onward, the time had come for the formal private Hacker to seek financial help from Uncle Sam. Like most of his brothers in arms, Karl Hacker applied for a federal pension for his services to the Union in those hard-trying days of the 1860s. He submitted his first papers in the fall of 1878, 13 years after the war ended. As was the case for most of the former fighters, it was a long, tangled, bureaucratic effort, one in which special pension attorneys were even involved. The veteran and Mokena resident spent years in a back and forth with Washington in an effort to get the highest possible compensation for his time in the Army. The basis of his claim was the injury he suffered after the fall he took on drill on that day in 1865, which by then had required the more or less constant wearing of a truss. The complexities of getting the pension were compounded by the fact that there were no records of his having been treated by a regimental surgeon, who at the time of the fall, in Karl Hacker's recollection, took a look at him, fitted him with a truss, and more or less said, "We'll see what happens." He didn't press the issue at the time, because as he recalled years later, he considered the injury, under the circumstances it occurred, as more of a disgrace than an honor. Also complicating things were the fact that 2 buddies who were intimately familiar with Hacker and his injury were no longer alive by the time the pension process started, with one having died in the war and the other in Kansas after the conflict, or so he had been informed. His cousin, fellow St. John's member Frank Kitzero, who served side by side with him in the Civil War, couldn't be of much help either, writing that he knew Hacker to be hale and hearty before the war, and that he was familiar with the rupture, but at the end of the day wasn't sure exactly how his cousin had received it. All things considered, on November 8th, 1890, Uncle Sam finally granted Hacker $8 a month, or about $250 in today's money. By the 1890s, the wearing of the truss had also come with its own issues, which in the words of Dr. Edmund Lynch, fellow Union veteran and Mokena medicine man, left Hacker's skin chafed and reddened, while another doctor wrote that the debilitating injury left him capable of performing about 1/4 of an able-bodied man's labor. In the eyes of the experts, he was suffering from a complete hernia. Carl Hacker hung up his railroad worker's tools and retired around 1911. Before he called it quits after 4 decades of service, he received a hefty reward from the Rock Island for having kept the best section of the line. As of May 22, 1912, his pension had been generously raised, and he was now taking in $15.50 per month for his services in the Civil War, or a little over $450 in current figures. He was a respected man in Mokena, as is evidenced by the 3 terms he was elected to serve on the village board from 1896 to 1902, and was also a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, the venerable nationwide organization of Northern veterans. Carl Hacker breathed his last on October 24th, 1916, at his home on McGovney Street, having reached the age of 70 years, surpassing the life expectancy for an American male in his day by 2 decades. His loved ones buried him in the family plot in St. John's Cemetery on Wolf Road, where to this day his dark red gravestone holds watch. An American flag, placed on the earthen mound by caring hands, can always be found billowing over his dust. Carl Hacker's name won't be found in any grand histories of the Civil War, but he nevertheless played an important role in the siren call of his generation and the biggest crisis our country ever faced. His memory is enthroned not only in the Valhalla of Union heroes, but in the pantheon of Mokena's history.
So, Matt, one of the things you mentioned was that the Hackers also were one of the families that went to Missouri and spent 2 years there.
That is true.
Do you know anything more about their time in Missouri?
You know, I don't really know any good details other than that that Philip Hacker, I believe it was Philip, the youngest, was born there. But there was something, I don't want to say the word exodus, because it's not like everybody went down to Missouri back then. But there was something going on in that sort of post-Civil War period that led more than a couple Mokena families, or even you could say Eastern Will County families, to move down there. Like our avid listeners will remember that fellow Civil War veteran Elijah McGovney and his family also went to Missouri.
For a 2-year period of time as well.
In that same time frame. Yeah, exactly. So it leads me to think there must have been something down there that was enticing people, be it maybe really cheap land or there was some sort of opportunity down there that existed that wasn't available up here. I don't know if anybody from our neck of the woods went down and stayed. I'm sure somebody did, but the historic record has only left us with those who went down there, kind of stayed for a couple years, and then came back. So whatever it was that was drawing them down there must not have completely panned out for them.
Probably all that humidity in the summer.
Yeah.
It's pretty brutal.
It is. If they thought it was bad up here,
yeah, right.
Then, yeah.
Do we know anything about what happened to Carl's brother, Christian?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, we do. Christian Hacker, so he sort of lived out here in our area when they first got to America, but I'm pretty sure... Oh, when was this? Because I've looked into his life, too. You know, I can't quite remember offhand. But at some point, he wound up in Joliet, Christian Hacker, where he became very successful. Can't totally recall I wish I could offhand what business he was involved with. But he also, if I remember correctly, was pretty involved in Joliet politics. So yeah, Christian Hacker, Carl Hacker's brother, did pretty well for himself. Just like his brother, they kind of had like an American success story. They toughed it through the journey getting here, where they were basically kids, volunteered to go fight in this horrible war for America, and eventually became successful and raised families.
Yeah, and again, two 17 and 18-year-old boys that came on a ship from Germany.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And then, so we mentioned that George was mayor for 14 years.
Oh, yes,
but Carl also served on the village board.
He did. Yeah, he was involved in the local doings with the powers that be. He was. You really can see that he was a respected guy in Mokena because he was elected against other people multiple times to sit on the village board of Mokena. So yeah, you could tell he was a guy that people looked up to around here.
And Maria Hacker lived another 11 years after Carl passed away.
She did.
Is there anything more about the rest of her life?
Not that I've ever happened across. Just that I can assume that she lived the rest of her days in peace with her family here in Mokena.
In the same McGovney Street home?
As I have been led to believe by the historical evidence, I do believe she continued to live there because the house on McGovney Street was in the family for quite a long time. At least until around World War II, if I remember correctly. So,
and yeah. Are there any hackers still around in the area?
That's another good question. Not in Mokena proper. I had contact with a descendant of Carl and Maria Hacker, who I believe was a botsman. And anybody who's listening who's a longtime resident of the area will recognize a botsman as being a big New Lennox name. She would have been descended through George Hacker, Mayor George Hacker's daughters, because one of them, I believe, married a New Lennox botsman. Can't remember where she lived, though. In any case, it was not in Mokena. So they're out there. There are family members out there. But as far as I know, none of them live in Mokena anymore, unfortunately.
Again, this is another great story, sharing a war hero, a town hero. I love how you ended your story and said his memory is enthroned not only in the Valhalla of Union heroes, but in the Pantheon of Mokena's history.
Yeah.
And what a great way to express how important he was and the hackers were to our community.
Absolutely, yeah. I really hope that my piece did him and his family justice, because they're a big part of our community's history and our country's history. What with Carl Hacker having been a Union soldier, I mean, it's a pretty big deal. So
absolutely,
yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Matt and I would like to thank you so much for listening. And if you're enjoying our podcast, we would love it if you would leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have an idea for a show or a question we can try to answer, you can just send us an email at MokenasFrontPorch@gmail.com. You can also send us a message through Facebook or Instagram. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.